And I want you to remember that no bastard ever won war by dying for his country.
And there you have it, the famous words of George C. Scott, portrayed as General George Patton. And we begin our show today with you. Keep in mind those words and where they're from. I'm Harper LeBel. Welcome, everybody. This is Take 5 with Steven Travers. You're watching 100 Yards of Football. We appreciate you being here. Logan Landers is our producer and engineer. Take 5 today is going to have a little bit different turn. Steven Travers, obviously, you know, he's been an author, written over 33 books. And today we're going to go over one of those. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Duke, the Longhorns, and Chairman Mao. Now, Steven, when you talk about a book and a cover and a title, they're critical. Tell me first and foremost, how did this title end up being a part of your final version where you go, I'm not going to budge. It is a part of it. It makes everybody wonder. They always have to ask a question. And was that the intrigue that got you with that title in the first place?
Yes. Thank you, Harper. Yeah, I knew right away that it was an intriguing title. You would look at it and you'd say, well, what is this? And, you know, when you see the Duke, most people usually think it's probably John Wayne. And then the Longhorns, well, who is that? Well, it's got to be the Texas Longhorns. And Chairman Mao is pretty obvious. The question is, how in God's name are we connecting these three disparate figures, characters, or subjects into a single book? And that's what my book does. Came out in 2014 with Roman Littlefield, which owns Taylor Trade. And I might say that Rick Reinhardt, our publisher, said that it was the best book he ever published, in his opinion.
Well, we'll get into it. But what was the impetus for you? How did you say, you know what, there's something that I want to write about? You're normally a sports exclusive author, but you dipped your toe in a different pool, if you don't mind me putting it that way, right? The entertainment business. You're going into politics a little bit. You're looking at college football for obvious reasons, just from the title itself. How do you tie all those in together to where they all have some sort of a, it happened once upon a time in Hollywood type of a situation, if I can borrow a line from the movie that came out just a few years ago?
It actually starts with our friend Mike McDowd, who's been on this show. And Mike suggested to me, you should write a book about John Wayne and his association with USC and USC football, because John Wayne was a football player and a longtime fan and season ticket holder of the Trojans. And so I really felt that was a good idea and thought that I wanted to do it. And I was looking for a hook, and the hook came to me while I was researching the book One Night, Two Teams, Alabama versus USC, and the game that changed a nation.
So the follow-up with that is, for me at least, the entertainment world, the music world, the sports world, they have a tie-in, don't they? There's an audience that is being fought for. It sometimes carries over to where there can be sports fans that love movies and they love music for obvious reasons. And there are some that only attach to one. What was in the creative process, your ability to kind of bring several different layers of depth and storyline into one book?
Well, you're absolutely right. Sports and entertainment and Hollywood have always intertwined with each other, no more so than the University of Southern California. It's literally a school that advertises itself as Hollywood School. This is what they call themselves when the band comes out to play. And, you know, you have the film school, you have all the celebrities who've gone to USC or send their kids there. And at the time that this was happening, I was an adjunct at USC. I was a guest panelist in classes at Annenberg Communication School. Annenberg has, at that time, was connecting with the film school at USC, and I was connecting with the film school at USC. Eventually, I did teach a class a symposium there. That hadn't yet happened. It happened a little bit later, but the process of connecting myself with Annenberg and with the film school was happening during this period of time. So there was no question that if you're going to do a book about sports and Hollywood, USC, John Milius, director of Apocalypse Now, maybe the greatest quote. He said, USC is the West Point of Hollywood, and that's absolutely correct.
Yeah, it really has kind of proven itself over the years. The alumni, the way that they continue in their growth, their creativity. Things change in Hollywood all the time, but sometimes they stay the same. So I appreciate your mentioning of that. All right, well, let's get into the book itself. Tell us a little bit about it. And I'm going to ask a few questions. I may even stop you at one point or another, just for clarity, of course.
Absolutely.
But tell me a little bit about, where this comes from. I'll ask you a little bit about, the research and everything about that a little bit later. But the book itself.
Okay.
Lawrence and Chairman Mao. How does it begin?
It's the threads are fascinating. I mean, this was investigative journalism at its best. This is almost connecting dots like a CIA thread. So it starts, as I say, when I'm researching One Night, Two Teams. In particular, there are three people who I am interviewing, and they all tell me a similar story. Concerns John Duke Wayne, football player at USC, longtime USC alumnus. In 1966, Duke Wayne is in Texas. He's filming the War Wagon. The opening game of that season is USC at Texas in Austin. John Wayne decides he wants to go to the opening game of the season. He drives to the game. He arrives on a Friday before the game. As he's getting out of his car, he sees Tim Rossovich and Mike Battle, two USC players who were members of his fraternity, Sigma Chi. Says hi to them, exchanges a little bit of small talk. Enters the hotel and quickly goes with his friend Gus Pappas, fraternity brother and football teammate, to a party being held in the main ballroom of this hotel. The hotel is where the Trojans are staying and where most of their alumni are staying. High-end Boston hotel. Much drinking, much eating, much frivolity ensues. John Wayne starts to drink heavily. The story is told to me by Tom Kelly, former play-by-play announcer for the Trojans, now deceased. Craig Fertig, former quarterback, then coach of the Trojans, now deceased. A third guy was a broadcaster. I don't have his name, but he used to work with Ray Scott a lot, and he tells the story. The story is this. Wayne begins to get intoxicated, and he begins to pontificate about America's involvement in the Vietnam War, and he starts saying, we're going to go through those commie bastards like crap through a goose. We are going to use their guts to grease the treads of our tanks. And he starts using this kind of war verbiage, right? In the meantime, standing off to the side is a reporter for the LA Times, Harley Ace Tinkham, he started the old morning briefing that I'm sure you recall in the LA Times. Harley is a liberal. He opposes the Vietnam War, and he does not like John Wayne. He also is a big-time alcoholic and does not hold his liquor well. I talked to his daughter later, and this was all confirmed, and she basically confirmed that she didn't know the story, but it sounded like her dad. As Wayne is pontificating, he walks up, screws up his curves, walks up to John Wayne. Duke, you ain't shit. At which time John Wayne rears back and takes a mighty swing at Harley Tinkham. Gus Pappas pulls Duke away, which saves Duke about $1 million in legal fees. He misses him by about an inch. Somebody sort of grabs Tinkham and says, you've had enough. And gets him back to his room, and Wayne continues to drink. Next, you have John McKay and Marv Goo. McKay, the coach, Marv Goo is assistant coach. And they have gone out to dinner that night. They may have gone to a movie, and they are just arriving back at the hotel. As they get there, McKay suggests, let's go to the ballroom and let's see what's going on, shake a few hands before we go to bed. They do, and they get in just in time to see Wayne make this speech. Tinkham approach him, Wayne take his swing, and the aftermath of that. So it's witnessed by them. They then leave. Two people take care of John Wayne and get him to his room because he is scheduled to speak to the Trojans at breakfast in the hotel the next day. One is Craig Fertig. The other is Ron Schwery. Ron Schwery is the student manager of the USC football team. He was for 2 years, 66 and 67. This is such a prestigious job that it's like being a Supreme Court clerk. If you're the student manager, you are set for life. You can go to whatever law school you want to. You can work in the film industry. You can work in banking. Everything's open to you. Schwery helps Fertig get Wayne to his room, and in so doing makes an introduction to Wayne, and this will play out later. So we have that aspect of it. Next, and I'm interviewing Charlie Young, Manfred Moore, Sam Bam Cunningham about that evening. And also, this is also for a later book called What It Means to Be a Trojan. And they're talking about Marv Goo, and they're talking about John McKay. And they are mentioning that it's about 1970, and two big movies are playing at that time. They're both polar opposites. One is Easy Rider, the other is Patton. And McKay basically and Goo both tell these guys, the night before the game, do not go see Easy Rider. If you want to see it on a Sunday after the game, fine. The night before the game, you go see Patton. That'll get your testosterone up, get you ready to play the game. So they go, okay, we'll go see Patton. So this is Young, Manfred Moore, Cunningham, probably a wide receiver named Edessel Garrison, possibly Lynn Swan. Swan always was tagging along, trying to hang out with them, and sometimes they let him do it, and sometimes they didn't. It's kind of funny. Anyway, so they go see the movie Patton. The movie ends. They're standing on the sidewalk, and they're kind of looking at each other with a funny look on their faces, like, is it just me, or did that cat Patton say a lot of things that Marv Goo says to us in our pregame speeches? And they all start to agree, yeah, he did. So Marv Goo, his job was to make pregame speeches. This is before Heritage Hall was built. So this was be done in a place called the Dungeon on the SC campus. They get the team in there. They would somehow get the band in there, the cheerleaders, and if it was a home game, it would be on Friday. If it was a road game, it would be just maybe the Thursday before they headed to the airport, and he would make these amazing speeches firing the team up. Marv Goo had been a football star at USC, then an assistant coach, but he had a connection to Hollywood. He was a gladiator in the movie Spartacus. In that movie, every single gladiator in the movie was either a USC or UCLA football player. One of the stars of the movie, an African-American named Woody Strode, was a former 6'7" wide receiver at UCLA, who played with Jackie Robinson. He had a key moment in the movie where he dies so that Kirk Douglas's character can live. He also had a checkered past with John Wayne. Some people said that there was some racial animosity. My looking into it indicated it was more USC-UCLA rivalry than that. And so Marv Goo makes this speech every night before games, and he's quoting Kirk Douglas, and he's saying, I would rather die standing up than live like a slave on my knees. And among other things that Kirk Douglas says, he's quoting from the movie. And that particular phrase kind of refers to UCLA had beaten the Trojans maybe 2 years in a row, and this was considered, just beyond the pale, cannot be allowed to happen. It's like being enslaved by sin to lose to UCLA, okay, in the minds of people like Marv Goo. However, after Marv Goo observes John Wayne say what he says in Texas in '66, he starts to change his speech, and he starts using this inflammatory war language. We're going to go through them like crap through a goose. We're going to use their guts to grease the cleats of our cleats, and these kinds of inflammatory war verbiage, violent war verbiage. And this is what Charles Young and Manfred Moore are referring to when they say, this is what Coach Goo was saying, and isn't that what Patton was saying? Well, this is the point where I, who's interviewing them, a light goes on in my head and it goes, hey, I think I see my next book and the book that Mike McDowd told me I should write, which is John Wayne's connection to the USC football team. So next I'm asking myself, okay, how does the speech make it from Austin in '66 to the screen in 1970? Well, we start with John Wayne himself. Well, no, let's back off. Start with Darryl Zanuck, who headed 20th Century Fox. In 1952, he's approached by a producer. He was a young man who had served with George Patton in World War II. He comes to Zanuck. He wants to make a movie about Patton's life. Zanuck thinks that's a great idea. They approach the Patton family. The Patton family says, no way, we're not letting Hollywood and a bunch of Hollywood liberals ruin the memory of the great George Patton. You're not going to be allowed to do it. So the movie gets put on ice, very much like One Night, Two Teams has been put on ice for the past 17, 20 years, as we've discussed on the show with Karen McCluggage. But it's not that I'm worried about that or thinking about that much. Anyway, so finally in 1962, Darryl Zanuck produces The Longest Day, which is a story about the Normandy invasion. The star of the movie is John Wayne. On the strength of this movie and on the strength of Wayne's performance, they go to John Wayne, said, how would you like to play the role of George Patton in a movie about Patton? Wayne says, I would. They also have two new properties that they could go to without necessarily using the Patton family. A Soldier's Story by General Omar Bradley, and a Patton Ordeal and Triumph by Ladislas Farrago. They both come out right around the same period of time, and they can use this as property as opposed to getting the life story rights of the family. So now John Wayne is it makes sense to me that he's going to be researching George Patton. He might be spending time at the USC Film School. It's his alma mater. And at the same time, Zanuck hires a screenwriter named Calder Willingham. This guy made more money doing less than any other screenwriter in history. He got credit for writing The Graduate, although it was a first draft that hardly was used. Buck Henry did it, and he did other movies in which John Milius really did the writing. And the same thing happens with this. He tries and he looks at it, and he's an English guy, and he goes to Zanuck and says, "There's no story that in this book, mainly Farrago's book. It's all battles and strategy and all this kind of thing, and that's not really much of a story." So he gets off the project. Who are we going to give it to? Well, there's a young director, writer in Hollywood, who's still in his 20s. His name is Francis Ford Coppola. And they give it to Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola is anti-war, doesn't believe that we should be in Vietnam, does not like George Patton. He decides he's going to write an anti-war screed that makes George Patton look crazy. He is going to be someone who's consumed by the idea of reincarnation. He is violently war hungry. He's unhinged. He is the kind of person that is an example in his mind of a military figure who should be reined in by the good politicians of America. And he writes it that way. And eventually they like his writing, but they don't understand what he's written. They get him off of the project and they give it to another guy named Edmund North, who's more of a militarist, and he infuses it with more war scenes and military verbiage and that kind of thing. So in the meantime, John Wayne drops from the project because he is going to do the Green Berets instead. The screenplay then goes to Rod Steiger. He says, I don't want to do it. I'm a pacifist. Goes to a few other people. They all more or less say, I don't want to do it. It glorifies war. The Vietnam War is going on. People won't go see it. They don't want to be in it. Finally goes to George C. Scott. George C. Scott reads it. He's a former Marine, actually, although he's not particularly crazy about war. He reads the Coppola screenplay and the second version. He says, I'll do it, but only if we do the Coppola screenplay. I like the fact that this guy believes in reincarnation and he's very introspective. This is where the material is. This is where I can do real acting and really use my charisma on screen to show a human being, not merely an automaton, not merely a war-thirsty general, but somebody like that. Okay, so that's that backstory. So now we got to get to how does it get from John Wayne to the screen. Well, we already had John Wayne, obviously was going to be in it, but now he's dropped out of it. We have Ron Schwery. Ron Schwery was a film student at USC. He has gotten to know John Wayne. Later, John Wayne will help him become a member of the Producers Guild, and he will win 2 Academy Awards for Tootsie and Ordinary People. One of his friends is John Milius. John Milius is, at this time, a student at USC who is contemplating making a war movie called Apocalypse Now, which he's working on with George Lucas. Schwery knows that Milius is a connoisseur of war. He says, you've got to hear this guy, John Milius, you've got to hear this guy, Marv Gu, speak to the team. I don't absolutely know this happened, but I think that he snuck Milius into the dungeon. He heard the speech. He made notes. Who does John Milius know? Well, he knows Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola knows all the guys, the screenwriters and the young filmmakers at UCLA and USC. They will all be part of his Zoetrope crew, which will gather in just a couple of years in San Francisco and eventually make Apocalypse Now. Goes to Coppola, basically says, I should be writing this screenplay about Patton. I'm the guy who really knows more about Patton than you, but since you're the one writing it, here are some really great notes that would be great in the movie. If you study the opening scene of this movie, and we heard a little bit of it at the beginning of the program, there really is not an awful lot of evidence in any of the books or any of the material that Patton said these things. Some people, some evidence that maybe the speech was patterned after a speech that Patton made before the amphibious invasion of Morocco in November of 1942, but we can't really get to the bottom of it. it really looks like it's kind of made up by Francis Ford Coppola. And where did he get it? I think he got it from John Milius, who got it from John Wayne. So that's the beginning of the story. And just to wrap this up before you ask a question, is after Coppola wrote this, he goes off to San Francisco and forms Zoetrope, and he's doing like weird movies with Robert Duvall and sci-fi movies and strange things in San Francisco with George Lucas. And he gets a phone call, and it's 20th Century Fox, and they say, Francis, we have an editing machine that was made in Europe, and nobody knows how to fix it. And we understand that you worked on these machines when you worked in Europe. Can you fly to Los Angeles and help us fix the machine? He says, sure. He goes down. He's working on the machine. He looks up at the dailies, and he sees George C. Scott. And he says to somebody, what is that? He goes, that's our big picture for 1970 patent. Then, and only then, does Coppola realize that they're making the movie that he wrote, because he had been taken off. The second writer, North, actually also gets, well, all of them, Calder Willingham also gets a screen credit, but the main core of the movie was written by Coppola, who a year later is just about ready to be fired from being the director of The Godfather when he wins the Academy Award for Patton. And so Robert Evans says, well, I can't fire Coppola after he just won the Academy Award. So that's how he stays on in The Godfather. So those are some little threads that move on. So I've explained basically my theory, if you will, on how it makes it from a drunken speech by John Wayne in 1966 to a classic movie with George C. Scott in 1970.
And so many different things have happened, Stephen. You thoroughly explained one after another that kind of lead and tie in and mesh together with a little gas, a little clutch to forward not only just the process itself. So you gather all this, and then obviously, there's something here. Continue, obviously, please. And where does it go next, and how does the story turn into something that becomes not only a feature film backdrop has nothing to do with the film, but it has everything to do with how the film was being made, right? That the different strategies and people that were involved with that. And this takes place almost in every movie, doesn't it? I mean, couldn't many different movies say, yeah, we had this and that, and here's something nobody knew anything about, but yet there may be a book within the movie or a movie within the movie if people were able to see how these things are made and the connections that need to be put together in order for a film, a book, a song, or a team in a game, in order for all of that to take place. So obviously, please continue. I'm sorry, I've a little bit.
No problem. You're working on the connective tissues here. Well, certainly this story, when I told it and put it in written form to Rick Reinhardt, immediately intrigued him, and he knew he had a really great book. He knew that it and in my hands, and he knew that I could handle this, because by this time it was probably about my 7th book that I wrote with Rick and with Taylor Trade / Roman Littlefield. And he said, you're just the guy to do it, because I had my USC connections. I'm a former screenwriter myself. I know a lot about Hollywood, and I'm a big fan of John Wayne. So now we get back to, so it wasn't hard to sell the idea of the book. And so we also get back to Mike McDowell's original suggestion of making it about John Wayne and his association with USC. So I decided, okay, this is really the last chapter of the book, is the whole thread of the 1966 event. But I'm also going to tie it into his association with the Trojans and also with his work against communism in Hollywood, and how that had an effect on his life. So we get back, we're talking John Wayne. He's born Marion Morrison. He grows up mostly, he lives a few years in somewhere in the desert of California, moved to Glendale. He learns how to ride horses, moves to Glendale. He's riding horses. It's a chaparral environment. He's learning how to be a cowboy. He is an outstanding football player at Glendale High School, and he's unbelievably handsome. We all know the rugged John Wayne that we know from True Grit. He was incredibly good looking, so good looking that girls at Glendale High would literally go to church and pray that John Wayne would, Marion Morrison would ask them out. Marion had a dog named Duke. He would walk by the fire station. He became the mascot of the firemen, and they would say, "Here's Duke and Little Duke." Duke was the dog. Little Duke was Marion Morrison. He obviously grows up, and by the time he finishes high school, now he's Big Duke. And he never goes by Marion. He goes by Duke Morrison. Call me Duke. He gets a scholarship to play football for Howard Jones at the University of Southern California. 7 of his teammates from Glendale High are all recruited and make up the Trojans. This is Howard Jones is creating a national dynasty at USC. 1925 is going to be I think it's 1926 is going to be his sophomore year. He's slated to be a starting guard. 2 weeks before training camp, he hitchhikes with, I think, Gus Pappas to Newport Beach, where he loved to ride the waves. He was a body surfer. And there are some heavy waves down in Newport. This is where surfers call it the wedge. And people talk about victim of the wedge. There are literally bumper stickers that people have called victim of the wedge. People have had many serious injuries. And Marion Morrison sustains a serious injury, dislocates his shoulder, shows up for training camp, can't block. He is replaced by a man named Bryce Taylor. Bryce Taylor becomes the first All-American football player at USC. He's also African-American. And so this indicates how far ahead of a lot of schools USC was, even then, providing opportunities for African-Americans and integration in collegiate sports. Wayne is at USC at a time in which the school has a strong association with the film industry. Howard Jones provides jobs for his players working in the off season and in the summers at Fox Studios, where they're paid to be grips and stage guys and maybe sometimes small roles, non-speaking roles in large crowd scenes, or gladiators, or Pharaoh's army or something like that, which is big in those days. John Wayne is one of those guys. And this is big in recruiting, because who doesn't, you get to work in Hollywood, you get to make a little extra money. And of course, you probably, there's a lot of nice looking actresses and all these football players like that. One of these actresses is a girl by the name of Clara Bow. She's known as the It Girl. She was a huge star in the 1920s. She had quite a reputation, somewhat promiscuous, but she's not too happy with the guys she's meeting in Hollywood. They all seem to be about 5'4" and with thin shoulders, and half of them aren't real men, if you understand my meaning. Someone takes her to the Coliseum, and she sees the Trojans come out of there, and she falls in love. They're all 6'2", 200, and they're real men. She starts inviting these players to her house for parties, and they become, quite the party scene for these USC football players. And Joan Crawford is there, and Betty Davis is there, and young Hollywood, and these players are loving it. Some fun times are had. Some rumors get out there about Clara Bow. I can't get into it on this show, but if you just go to the internet and look Clara Bow USC football, it'll tell you the story. The actual fact is the worst of these rumors are not actually true. They had been invented by a disgruntled employee of Clara Bow in a lawsuit after she had been fired, and it turned out they weren't true. it was part of the reason Clara Bow's career didn't really go much beyond 1930. But that was really because she was getting older, and also once they went into talkies, she didn't have as good a voice. She mostly just looked really good in the early movies where she didn't have to speak. But one of the Trojans who was at some of these parties had been Marion Morrison. So Morrison, now he is dislocated his shoulder and he can't play. And the deal in those days is you lose your scholarship as soon as you are not in the starting lineup. He doesn't come from any money. He has to borrow money from his fraternity brothers. And it doesn't take long before he's on the bench and he eventually quits the team. He goes back to Fox Studios to work. He is assigned to teach Tom Mix how to be a cowboy. Mainly, he becomes Tom Mix's drinking buddy. Also, he works with, guess who? Wyatt Earp, who is a consultant to the Hollywood film industry and also is a consultant or still a deputy or a policeman or associated with the LAPD on police tactics. And so John Wayne is learning how to be a real cowboy. He knows how to ride, knows how to use a gun, and he sounds good. But he's working as a grip and a backstage guy for John Ford. They become friends. Ford is a former naval officer from World War II, and he and John Wayne become very good friends. They're both young guys. And 1927, the silent films era begins to fade out, and they now need people who can speak. So a lot of these actors, they have tinny voices, and they don't sound very good. And if you're in a cowboy movie, you need to sound like a cowboy. Well, who sounds like a cowboy, looks like a cowboy more than John Duke Wayne, right? So John Ford suggests Marion Morrison for a big 1929 talking movie called The Big Trail. And he gets the role. He's the star of it, and it launches his career. The powers that be say, well, we don't think you should be called Marion Morrison. You should be named John Wayne. That's a good name for you. To his friends and everybody who knew him, he's always Duke. He'd always been Duke. He was never married. He's always Duke. So he's Duke Wayne. And in 1939, he's up for an Oscar and makes a really big hit. And war breaks out. Wayne is not in the war. He has 4 children. This is the main reason he's given a pass. You could argue, and I will argue, that he made a bigger contribution to the U.S. by making patriotic war movies and doing patriotic things that fired up the country and the soldiers. Others will disagree. Wayne himself always felt bad about the fact that he didn't serve, and John Ford relentlessly gave him a hard time about it. Ford even came back and saw action filming at Midway and making movies like Why We Fight with Frank Capra. But Wayne is now a huge star. The war ends. We're now up against communism, and John Wayne has gone from being what he called himself a socialist in the 1920s to being a very conservative guy, and he believes that communism is the biggest threat to the United States. And he begins to expose communism in Hollywood. And he had seen it up close. He worked with a director named Edward Demoniuk, who was one of the Hollywood 10. He was a legitimate card-carrying member of the Communist Party. A lot of people. There were many communists. The head of the writers' union was a actual known communist. There were 4 known paid communists working in Franklin Roosevelt's White House Oval Office. Alger Hiss was a communist who literally wrote the UN Charter, which sacrificed Eastern Europe to the Soviet bloc after the war, if you can believe that, and it's true. And a lot of people always said it wasn't true. After the Soviet Union was deconstructed in 1991, something known as the Venona Papers came out, and then it proved everything that was made true. Now, you had to look really at the conservative press in order to get to the bottom of it. I did look at it, and it was all true. So everything that John Wayne was fighting for, these were not false things. So that sets us up for what happens in 1949. We'll get into that, but I'm sure you have questions at this point.
Well, I do. I know that you had mentioned that John Wayne took some criticism for not being in the war. He also, if I'm not mistaken, Stephen, wasn't he in several of the movies or the shorts that were being put out of what to do? I mean, there was information about victory gardens and collecting rubber and metal and recycling things so that the war effort could go on, buying bonds, just explaining what the war process was. Hollywood was a big part of getting the word out. The newsreel of the day, people would go to movies on Saturdays and there'd be information that they would gather about the boys overseas and what they were doing. And then there'd also be things about what we could do at home. So wasn't he also participating in some of those activities? Maybe not every single one. And if not, I'm okay with that. But my goodness, if there's a man that made more movies, whether he was the admiral or the general or the captain or the lead in post-World War II movies or during the war, just to kind of keep the war effort going, was there anyone that was more active than John Wayne?
Well, his big one was the Fighting CBs. A lot of this other stuff, and then later on, he was Sergeant Stryker in, what was that? The great Marine movie in 1949. Logan, you might look that up. The name is somehow escaping me. But I think a lot of the people doing a lot of these other things that you're talking about, Frank Capra Sr. and John Ford and Ronald Reagan was doing a lot of this kind of thing. Wayne himself was really actually busy really making actual movies that were often about the war. But one of them was about the war, and Edward Demaniak was the director. This was around 1944. And Wayne had a big confrontation with Demaniak because I believe it was Back to Bataan. And Sands of Iwo Jima, great movie. In Back to Bataan, Demaniak was he was lessening the role of the American soldier and putting socialist and communist, replacing some of the screenwriting with socialist and communist messaging. And Wayne was seeing it, and he was not happy about it. And so they had a big disagreement on that. But later, when Demaniak was going before House Un-American Activities Committee, Wayne came to his defense and said, I had disagreements with him, but I'm really about rooting out spies more so than just left-wing people. It's a free country, and he should be able to have his opinion. I don't like it in the movies that I'm in, and I'm going to call it out. But you're free to have an opinion in America. What you're not free to do is to work on the side of the Soviet Union, which is increasingly becoming an enemy in the United States. Was unquestionably by 1947 it was, and other people realized. Speaking of George Patton, he knew it early on. So that was the situation. And so this leads to 1949. And let me see, what's the guy's name? Okay, Alexei Kapler. It's 1949, and Joseph Stalin is the dictator of Soviet Union. And he begins to hear about this guy named John Wayne, who's in the United States and who is exposing communist operations, actual espionage operations, actual propaganda operations that are being directed by Moscow and Wayne is getting too close to it, and he orders the assassination of John Wayne. Now, there is a filmmaker in the USSR named Alexei Kapler. Stalin's daughter is in love with Alexei Kapler. The problem is that Alexei Kapler is Jewish, and Joseph Stalin hates Jews as much as Adolf Hitler, and probably killed as many Jews as Hitler killed in the Holocaust. He probably did it over a longer period of time, but a death is a death. He throws Alexei Kapler in the gulags. He probably would have killed him, but let him stay alive for his daughter's sake. He later did get out, and I think he finally died in 1978. He's in the gulag, and at the time he runs into another guy who had been involved in the Russian film industry, and through his film connections had some background with Hollywood people. And not everybody died in the gulags. Not everyone was there until they died. This guy had like a 5-year sentence, for probably spitting on the sidewalk in front of a photo of Stalin. I mean, something as innocuous as that. Anyway, Kapler says to him, when you get out, and because the guy says, I'm going to the US, when you get out, warn this guy, John Wayne, that Stalin is trying to kill him. So this happens, and Wayne becomes aware of the fact that someone's trying to kill him. He goes to the FBI, but he says, and this is very important to this story, he says, I don't want anyone else to know. I don't want my family to know. I don't want the public to know. I don't want fans to know. This is something that you and I, that the FBI and I and a few of my people, mainly some stuntmen, are going to know about, and we're going to deal with this on our end. I'm not going to disrupt my career and have headlines in the LA Times or anything like that. So it comes down to 1952. In 1952, Wayne he's in Mexico, and he's filming, I think he's doing Rio Globo or Rio Grande, one of those movies. I can't remember for sure. And what happens is Wayne is going through a divorce from his second wife, Pilar. All of Wayne's wives were Latino women. He loved Latino women. And but he's going through a divorce. And Pilar she's bad news. Exactly, she had kind of a checkered past, and exactly how much of what I read was true, I don't know. But she hires investigators to get dirt on John Wayne. Wayne is in Mexico, and the studio has security sort of on the perimeter of the shoot. At first, they see these investigators that Pilar has hired, but in finding the investigators, they also find some communist infiltrators who are there to kill John Wayne. They are arrested, they're given over to the FBI, and that's the end of that. Exactly what they did with those guys, they questioned them and found out more. I don't know whether they kept them in the US, but that was the first attempt. So there were people who were there in Mexico trying to kill Duke in 52. It makes sense that they'd be in Mexico because there's always been a heavy communist concentration in Mexico that goes back to Trotsky had gone to Mexico after he was exiled by Stalin. Or he wasn't even exiled. He escaped Stalin. He was tracked down and killed in Mexico City. Frida Kahlo was a communist, and there was a lot of communist activity in Mexico. So it was probably easier to try to operate there than it would have been in, say, Southern California, which was a very, very patriotic and conservative place at that time. Los Angeles then is not the Los Angeles we know now. It was basically an evangelical southern city, but that's another story. The second event, 1954, this is classic. A lot of Wayne's security detail consisted of stuntmen who were loyal to them, led by a legendary stuntman named Yakima Knut, one of the great names ever. And he has all of his stuntmen, and they're working as a sort of a shadow security detail for Duke Wayne, and they've got their ear out, and they hear about these possible communists, and they go to these guys and they say, hey, we're interested in becoming communists. How do we find out more? And so they invite these guys to this, it's a restaurant or a lodge of some kind that's just down the street from the Burbank studios where Duke Wayne has an office. Duke is in his office with a screenwriter named Jimmy Grant. They're working on a script. And he hears Knut tells him, we're going to round up these communists. Calls up the FBI. These communists who are assassins come to this lodge, and they are attacked by all the stuntmen. Yakima Knut claims he calls it a god-awful fight, but they eventually knock all these guys back and have them sort of tie them up. And at which point Duke and Jimmy Grant show up with some FBI guys. They then put these assassins into a car and drive them to a remote beach in Ventura County, where they are on their knees. And Duke pulls out a gun and he aims it at them, and he says, you're going to tell us everything you know or I'm going to shoot you. And they spill the beans. We're here on behalf of Stalin, and we've done this, and we've done that, and those are the orders. And Wayne pulls the trigger, but it's got blanks in the gun. And according to the story, they are they don't want to go back to the Soviet Union because they think that, or they know that if Stalin finds out that they failed, they'll be killed. I'm not sure if I got to the bottom of this. I'm told they were sent back to Russia. I'm not really sure how that happened or whether it happened, but that's what I get at. Next, we get to 1958, and there is a Soviet-American Friendship Conference at MGM, and Wayne gets an invite. He does not want to go. He doesn't want to talk to any Soviets. Dwight Eisenhower contacts Duke and says, Duke, I want you to go there as a favor to me. He shows up. Who's there? Nikita Khrushchev. They meet, and Khrushchev says, Duke, I want to talk to you. They repair with interpreters to a sidebar where they're away from prying eyes and prying ears. Khrushchev says, I love your movies. I watch them in the Kremlin. What I like most about them is that it indicates the imperialist America's enslaving the poor red man, they're being stand-ins for the proletariat, proving socialism is superior. Wayne is not happy with this, calls them iron curtain pants. They're drinking, they're getting more drunk. That's not what it is, Khrushchev. There are stories about rugged individualism in America, a stand-in for the lonely man, as a cowboy, is the rugged individual, the American who stands on his own. They are arguing this point, and they're drinking, but they're starting to connect with each other when Khrushchev says, I must warn you, Stalin tried to kill you. And Wayne goes, yeah, I know. Khrushchev's like, oh, you knew? Yes, I did know about that. They were thwarted. And Stalin wanted to continue trying to get you killed when he finally died in 1953. I called off all Soviet attempts to kill you. So we're not trying to kill you anymore. I want you to know that. Well, that's nice to know, Nikita. However, Chairman Mao Zedong of Red China wants to kill you. And I can't do anything about him. He's crazy. So watch your back. Okay, so this conversation, and there's also some confrontation in this conversation. which I think very much mirrors, getting back to Patton, the confrontation where Patton meets the Soviet general at the end of World War II, and he says, "I do not care to drink with the Russian general or any other Russian son of a bitch." And this looks very much like this confrontation, some of the confrontation language that Patton has with Nikita Khrushchev, but then eventually, like in the movie, they have a drink and they find a little area that they can agree on, and actually become friends to the point where Wayne starts sending his favorite tequila to the Kremlin for Khrushchev to drink. So I'll get to how I found all this out about, but I'm going to give you a chance to rein in with a couple of questions at this point, Harper.
Well, yeah, sure. The Stalin assassination carried over with the regime in Khrushchev. And then we're still in the 50s. So from my standpoint, not only am I not born, but the Bay of Pigs, I guess, would be one of those areas where that was where America's defense against a very close Russian nuclear attack was probably at a peak. But this kind of built into it, didn't it? I would imagine that this event and a few others, you mentioned something a little while ago, Stephen. Let me ask you a specific question about communism in Hollywood. You had mentioned that it was there. The United States at this time with Senator McCarthy was going through, hey, if anyone's a communist, we're going to round you up and either put a noose around your neck or get you out of town. Talk about the tie-in between those two events, and that the nation, after World War II was over, had a concern about communism. But then again, there was also a very real threat because they were already there. So talk a little bit about how Hollywood and the defense of Hollywood against communism was becoming a more vocal battle.
Yes. Well, if you read the Venona papers, you see that communism was in Hollywood, and there's a difference between people who were just really left-wing or sympathetic to the Soviets. Those are fellow travelers. That's different from people who are getting their orders from Moscow, like Alger Hiss was, and also, I don't have his name, but the guy who led the writers' union in Hollywood. And I might add that communism between 1917 and to date has murdered 120 million human beings. Adolf Hitler in the Holocaust killed 12 million. So he's like a piker compared with communism in terms of how many people got murdered overall. So in my opinion, I think McCarthy made a lot of mistakes, but he was more correct than he realized. He just went overboard. But to me, there's absolutely no difference between rooting out a Nazi and rooting out a communist. If you find a Nazi who's got some influence in screenplays and movies, you're going to try to get him out of there. To me, you do the same thing with a communist. That's my humble opinion then and now. And so obviously, once you get to the point of nuclear weapons, now it's high stakes. And so this was going into the 1960s. So this leads to the Chairman Mao part of the book and how I find out about it, or how anybody finds out about it. It starts with Orson Welles. Orson Welles, good friend of John Wayne, great actor, legendary figure. Orson Welles is I believe he was in Shanghai. And I want to say, I think he made a movie called Lady of Shanghai. Maybe that's when he was there, but he was in Shanghai, and he meets a number of Chinese dissidents who had escaped Mao. And they tell him Chairman Mao wants to assassinate John Wayne. So he tells John Wayne, and Wayne is like, well, I kind of already knew this, Orson, because Nikita Khrushchev told me that in 1958. So again, watch yourself. John Wayne continues. He doesn't, the FBI knows, but they don't have specific threats. It's like after 9/11, you know that they're trying to get you, but you don't have a specific name or time. You just have to watch yourself. It's a tough way to live, but his family doesn't know. He doesn't want his wife and his family and his kids, doesn't want his fans to know, doesn't want it to be screaming headlines. He also knows that, if they find out about this, people will say it's John Wayne making something up because he doesn't like the communists. But it was happening. So we get to the third assassination attempt. Wayne is in Pleiku, Vietnam, 1966, USO tour. He's with the Marines. This is an outpost near where there's a lot of combat. He is with these guys. He has made some sort of a speech. He's kind of standing around. A couple of bullets land in the ground near him. They all surround John Wayne, and they get to the perimeter, and they send some patrols out into the jungle, and they find a sharpshooter. He has Chinese markings. He's not Vietnamese. He's Chinese. And he says, Mao, send me, get the big man, the big American actor. He doesn't even know his name, but he knows who to shoot at. And he says, Mao promises my family extra rations, and I will have great glory in China after I've accomplished this mission. But he's captured and given over to the authorities. Again, this is kept quiet. They're in an enclosed environment, and it's kept quiet. But Orson Welles knew about it, and he tells an English writer named Michael Munn. Michael Munn, I believe, was a publicist for Bob Hope. And so he had an association with the film industry, the entertainment industry. He interviews Orson Welles and hears about this. And he goes to John Wayne. John Wayne confirms it and says, I don't want anyone to know about it until after I'm dead. After I'm dead, you can write about it. Wayne finally passes away in 1979. Still, it isn't until 2003 that Michael Munn writes a book. I believe it was John Wayne, The Man and the Myth. I think it's a 2003 book, and it talks about these assassination attempts, how Orson Welles told him, and how he got it confirmed with John Wayne. And so this is the crux of the book. There was also a great event in 1965 when the war had just started, and Wayne speaks at USC, and Bob Hope is there, and Wayne is the guest speaker, and there's a lot of anti-war protest. There was less at USC than any of the other colleges, but there was some. And Wayne gets up there and he starts talking about the value of an education, how you're paying a lot of money for your education, you don't want it disrupted, you don't want your classes disrupted, and everyone comes around to John Wayne and gets a standing ovation, even from those who had disagreed. Whether that would have happened 4 years later, probably not, but it did happen that day. So the book is about all of these events, consistently tying the thread of John Wayne at USC, and then eventually John Wayne in Austin. And again, we're continuing with the anti-war theme, the anti-communist theme of John Wayne making the speech, and then how it eventually ends up in the movie Patton. It gets published in 2014. As I say, Rick Riley thought it was going to be the best book he'd ever published. We actually had quite a bit of publicity. The book did not do as well as we'd hoped. We didn't do as well as some of my earlier USC football books. I'm not sure why. There was, oddly enough, this has happened 2 or 3 times, another book, like I wrote a Jim Murray book, and then another book about Murray comes out at the exact same time. I wrote a Barry Bonds book. There was another book about Bonds, comes out at the exact same time. And this, again, John Wayne. And there was another book about John Wayne that came out. Whether that's the reason the book didn't do as well, I don't know. I also wrote a screenplay about it. I tried to get that made as a movie. Didn't really get anywhere. But it's one of my favorite books. It's one of my favorite stories. And obviously, the tale that I've just told to you and to our audience here at Take 5 with Steven Travers indicates a very colorful American story about an amazing figure and his role in our history.
Stephen, one of the fascinating things that you mentioned there, the 2014 date of the book being written, 35 years after John Wayne died, and another, 20 or 30 years earlier when these assassination attempts. So we're talking about a 50 or 60 year period of time in between when those things were actually happening and when we're finding out about it, or at least some of the innermost details. It kind of ties in there, people from a Christianity standpoint. How can you trust these gospels? They were written 40, 50 years after the death of Jesus. Well, sometimes it takes a little while to put some things together. That doesn't mean it's not accurate. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. But, a lot of folks don't have newspaper reporters writing things about their life that day. It takes a little time, and there's a maturity level and some other things. Would that come into play for you at all? Or just this is a story that took place in many cases 70 years ago? You're telling me about a very young high school football player that ends up going to USC. Some of the things that happened were to almost 2 generations postponed.
Well, let's first, you make a reference to the Gospels written between 40 and 70 years after the death of Christ. Everything that we know about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar was written 400 years after their deaths by Plutarch. He's the first historian who really writes about them, and then others pick up on it. And that's all taken as gospel truth, to use that term. So it's a lot more accurate than the Gospels are a lot more accurate than probably Plutarch's commentaries. And I guess I'll add this: they were written by people who were eyewitnesses to it and who were willing to die rather than deny Jesus. And all you got to do is say what didn't happen, and we'll let you go and give you a good meal. Nope. Says St. Peter, I want you to crucify me like him, but I'm not worthy of Christ, so I want you to turn me upside down. So tell me, and that's all been verified, so tell me that it's not gospel truth. Of course it's gospel truth. Now, getting back to, I was lucky enough to talk to some people who knew him personally, who knew John Wayne and were here and witnessed some of these events. Ron Schwery, I think he's still alive. He was still alive when I interviewed him with our friend Jake Downey, who's been on this show, at a deli in Marina del Rey. He gave me some of this. John Milius was sick and was unable to grant me an interview. I did have access to his daughter Amanda, who is a filmmaker, and his son Ethan, who is still a prosecutor in the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, and they confirmed some, but were not able to confirm all. I did interview Marv Gu for Street Zebra magazine in 2000. We did not get to John Wayne. That was not a great interview. And there was a lot. I was only about a 15-minute interview standing up on the field at UC Irvine during a USC preseason practice. Interviewed John McKay. We did talk a little bit about John Wayne because I knew he was a John Wayne fan, but it only got to the point of, I was a big fan of his, and I invited him to speak to the team on the day of the 1966 game against Texas. This is in 2000, long before I got into these threads that I later discovered, mainly by interviewing Tom Kelly, the great radio man, Craig Fertig, who was a good friend of mine, died way too soon, I can't remember who the other broadcaster was. He had been a guy who worked with Ray Scott, and he had done he had announced the 1966 USC Texas game, I think on national radio, I believe. And I think he had also announced the USC Alabama game from Birmingham, which was also on national radio. And they had all been in the ballroom that day. And then, of course, I had interviewed Charles Young, Manfred Boer. Manfred's not with us, but he was a good friend of mine, and Sam Bam Cunningham about Marv Goo and his speeches. So I did talk to people who had some eyewitness accounts of some of these events, some of these events. Obviously couldn't talk to John. Tried to get Gus Pappas. That was unfortunate. He just was, he was at the end, he had dementia, it was the end of his life and died shortly thereafter. And his son-in-law was a guy named Chuck Arobio, who played in the game. He gave me some background about the speech that Wayne made to the team that morning. Tim Rosevich was there. He told me about it. Mike Battle was at, but that was a speech that Wayne made to the Trojan team in the morning, not the drunken speech from the night before. But Fertig was able to talk to me. Fertig was always a great source of color. He also dressed John Wayne in the morning. McKay said, "Take care of Wayne. Make sure he gets to the breakfast on time." And Wayne, Craig, how you doing? I saw you beat Notre Dame in '64. You're a great quarterback. And how should I dress? And he goes, well, everyone thinks you're a cowboy. You're in Texas. Let's dress you as a cowboy. So he has a suit. He has like a 10-gallon hat. He's got cowboy boots. There are pictures of Wayne addressing the crowd from the sidelines at Austin that day. And then after the game, there's also the car that he drove to Austin I think it was a famed Cadillac that was later sold at auction. There was a lot of memorabilia from this trip and from Wayne's movie, The War Wagon, which was made with Kirk Douglas, came out about a year later. So there's a lot of ancillary stories about Wayne being in Texas that day, but it was kind of like me getting to the bottom of whether Sam Cunningham or whether Bear Bryant had said to Sam Cunningham, "This here's what a football player looks like." I'd gotten to the bottom of that story, and I got to the bottom of this story as best I could. So, I'm not just a historian and not just a writer. And not just a sports writer. I am a reporter, and that was really where I got a lot of praise from reviewers who said that Travers had really dug into the research in minute detail, because I did.
Yeah, some of the stuff, this isn't in a newspaper or access through confidential files with the CIA or the FBI. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you had to kind of tie in and piece together. And when did this happen? Which happened first? You're making the order and doing it in the best manner as you can with very limited amounts of information. What an arduous task, but obviously you were fit for it. You wanted to do it, and discovering some of these things out and digging deep, as you mentioned, that's a part of this process. For a young writer or someone who would like to be a young writer, was there anything that you learned from this that you go, wow, there's so many different ways of not just this story, but taking any story and encompassing so many of the different people that were a part of it and giving background on them and finding out as much as you can from different sources about them. But talk about the depth that it took to do that. And that's just part of the task of putting a good book or penning any good paper. It requires that, doesn't it?
Well, we were talking to Bruce Jenkins last week, and we got to the subject of suggestions for young writers. Number one is you got to go way beyond the internet, Google searches or AI searches. You got to go way beyond that. There's a lot of digging. First of all, you just need knowledge in the first place. And the only way you're going to have that is to read a lot of books. That's first. Second, I had been a screenwriter for 7 years. That was really how I got started. Ayn Rand, who's one of my favorite novelists, she started as a screenwriter. I think screenwriting is a really good way to get started because it teaches you how to really get right to the point, make it colorful and watchable. And so I always wrote with a cinematic flair. That's how I wrote One Night, Two Teams, and even some of my other baseball books were, I wrote it like you're looking at The Natural or something like that. That was the way I looked at it and wrote about it. This was, and I did write a screenplay based on this book and really didn't get anywhere because other than Carrie McCluggage and Barry Kemp, who have been consumed with getting One Night, Two Teams turned into a movie, I really didn't have a lot of connection with the film industry by 2015, as I had maybe if I'd written it 10 years earlier when I was talking to Ronnie Howard and I was Taylor Hackford and Jeff Daniels, and Kevin Costner and some of these other people who were floating around the possible pre-production of One Night, Two Teams. But by the time I wrote this, but it really would make a great, what's your opinion? I think it would make a great movie. John Wayne fending off assassinations and stuntmen trapping communist spies in a Burbank lodge and turning them over to the FBI and taking them to Ventura, where Wayne puts a gun to their heads and pulls the trigger and it's blanks. Wayne, later scenes with an older John Wayne, drunk in a ballroom at Austin, Texas, surrounded by the USC band, while a LA Times sports writer takes a swing at him and misses him. Or no, he takes a swing at an LA Times sport. I also talked to Harley Tinkham's daughter, who, as it turns out, graduated with me from USC. She sent me photos of Harley at her ceremony, and it was the same ceremony that I participated in when I graduated from USC. And Ronald Reagan was the speaker. And he had just come back, if you're going to tie everything, he had just come back from Red China. So, there's just so many threads connecting the tissue of this story. But yes, I'd say write in a cinematic way, study new journalism, write about how these guys write true stories as novels, which is Tom Wolfe, Norman Mailer, Hunter Thompson, Pat Jordan. They write true stories, but they're not dry. They write it in a novelistic and colorful way. That's my style, and that's my recommendation to young writers.
And because of that, there's several lessons learned, but you get to pen something and take authorship of a book that you finished, and the parameters of it are still kind of like a James Bond spy movie where you have bullets and plots and all kinds of different things that are associated with one of the great movie heroes.
Harper, this is Dr. No meets the Green Berets.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Chinese spies and USC Trojan football players. It's great.
Yeah, and the fact that you got, one of America's great movie heroes of all time, like him or hate him, nobody can deny that there was a time. Now, I didn't see any of the movies. I wasn't born until 1963. So, True Grit was something that I would understand because I was old enough to understand it. And that was at the end of his career, his life in 78, 79. He finished True Grit right before he died.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's anyone in America that wouldn't say, well, I gotta tell you, partner, you know, some of the things that John Wayne did, that everyone knew who he was. And then there was this aspect of it. So again, putting this book together and being able to talk about it, thank you for that. Any final thoughts you have, Steven, before we head out? I mean, just the book itself, the research, you've done so much, but now the aftermath. Tell me a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Another perfect question. You teed it up for me. I got to throw this in there. By God, girl, that's a Colts Dragoon. I wouldn't be scared of no boogeyman if I was toting one of those. Nip a whiskey against the night air. Wouldn't hurt you none. Out there in the field, you'd be crying, Mama, Mama. Nip a whiskey against the night air. So that's from True Grit. I'll tie it up with this last bow. I had mentioned earlier that the Patton family was adamant that they not give the life story rights to 20th Century Fox. But 20th Century Fox goes ahead and they're going to make the movie. They make the movie anyway. It is released. The Patton family has a lawsuit, cease and desist, which they are ready to deliver to 20th Century Fox, saying, stop showing this movie. You don't have our permission. You're going to be sued. You're going to owe us a lot of money. The movie plays. Someone or some people in the family, including their lawyers, goes to a movie theater somewhere in Boston where they lived and sees it. And it's so good because George C. Scott took all these aspects that Coppola had written about the reincarnation, and he's slightly unhinged and he's crazy, and he had turned, and he was all those things, but in a charismatic manner, and Scott ties it all together in such an incredible performance that you love him and you admire him for all his faults. And the Patton family very quietly withdraws the lawsuit, and of course the lawsuit never comes about, and they quietly admire the movie. And in fact, I'll even finish it up with this. I had a friend at USC named Bob Carl. He was from Greenwich, Connecticut. He moved back to Greenwich, and probably around somewhere in the late 90s, he calls me and he goes, "Hey, Steve, I'm at a Little League game in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I'm got somebody here I want you to talk to." He puts this guy on the phone. It's George Patton's grandson, who had a son playing in the same Little League as Bob's son. And, I say, well, I'm a huge admirer of your grandfather and of the movie Patton. I didn't know any of these facts that I'm discussing with you, but I had a nice conversation with him. It was great that I actually talked to somebody who was a member of his family, and he was a suburban dad, but he had gone to West Point himself, and the whole family went to West Point. They'd all served, and the Patton, I think his father had served in Vietnam. It ties together very nicely, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of. So I knew it would be a fun thing to talk about today.
Interesting in that movie, the Patton movie itself, how the family withdraws the lawsuit after realizing that George was guilty of doing several things that the movie portrays to be outlandish. He slaps a soldier who's in a MASH unit. He would visit soldiers, but this one occasion, and I know that happened. I mean, I know that historically it may not have been exactly as it happened, but I'm well aware that incident did occur. And what you're saying is that there were several others that did occur, but guess what? He's still the hero. He's still the good winner that we are able to celebrate. The speech at the beginning of the movie, the Russian vodka drink that you have when you say, I'm not going to drink with that son of a bitch. And that guy says, this, the Russian interpreter doesn't want to talk about it to his general, but the two of them end up having a laugh and a drink together because of it. And everything that was in between that. When Carl Malden says, you've lost it, George, he's still the hero. So great movie. And I'm glad the family withdrew. It wasn't perfectly portrayed. There are probably numerous things that the family could say, that didn't happen. And it didn't happen like that. But they still, and that's what Hollywood does. They recreate things in their own image. And Francis Ford Coppola certainly did. And I think maybe Francis Ford Coppola would probably admit, I was out to get him a lot more than George C. Scott was. And thank goodness George C. Scott was not out to get him, at least not in a way that was vengeance ridden. So all that being good. All right, Steven, we're gonna wrap it up here. Final thoughts here before we go. It's called The Duke, The Longhorns, and Chairman Mao, and it is your depiction of the life and so many different things that took place with John Wayne and so many people around him, Hollywood directors, presidents, and communist leaders, and so many different people. Final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but reflect on the movie. And George Patton represents a certain kind of historical figure that has been necessary since the Roman Empire. He's the general who's willing to get the job done during times of crisis. And when the war ends, we put him in a closet and hide him and pretend he's not there anymore. And that's kind of was his life and a lot of people's lives in both politics and in the military. But, this was, and John Wayne was, he was a controversial figure himself. But, he was beloved, even Jane Fonda loved John Wayne. Barbara Streisand was good friends with John Wayne. He got along with people. He was a beloved figure. He was a good man. He helped people. He helped Ron Schwery get his career started. And he was a good father. He was not without faults, but who among us will cast the first stone?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. All right. The book, The Duke, The Longhorns, and Chairman Mao, it is available through Amazon. One final thought, if you don't mind me saying so. Frank Gans was a head coach of the Kansas City Chiefs back in the 80s. He was a special teams coach, a guru that many people celebrate. Frank Gans had a pregame speech, like you mentioned with Marv Goo. And he had studied Patton through his time at Annapolis in the Naval Academy. He tells the story a little bit like this. When the generals were meeting to assemble an army to put everything that we could that was available against the onslaught that was going to be the Battle of the Bulge. Mm-hmm. Patton was asked by Bradley and by Eisenhower and all these other generals that were meeting in a secret place. How can we get this done? We just don't have time. There's not enough time to move our armies into position. And Patton, who was late arriving because of technical difficulties with roads and planes and just delays, gets there. He goes, "We'll be there tomorrow." George, there's no way. You're 3 days away. There's no way you can do it, even in good weather, and it's not good. How on earth could you go back and get your troops where they need to be to defend these folks here in Bastogne? We left yesterday. And that was the message. It wasn't in the movie, but it was something that Patton had said. He knew that there were some problems that were occurring, and he, without orders, moved his guys so that they could be there. Being in a position where they left yesterday, they saved a complete day, and they were able to get there on time. And it's one of the really cool things that any Patton historian would say, that man there was something unique and different about him. And you get to celebrate a little bit about him, John Wayne, obviously, and so many Hollywood directors, the threat of communism and everything in between. So we want to say thank you to Steven Travers for celebrating his book. Again, it's called The Duke, It's called The Longhorns. It's called And Chairman Mao. I'm tying those all together. It's all one title, but you can get it through Amazon. And Steven, they might be able to send a copy to you and have it autographed. Is that something that you would be able to do for our listeners and our audience here today?
Sure. Send a comment below or find me on Facebook. Let me just add, in the movie, what Patton says when when he says, "Can you rescue the guys at Bastogne?" is what they're looking to do. The meeting takes place in Verdun, and he goes, "My staff's already been working on it." And lastly, Marv Goo's father died in the Battle of the Bulge fighting on Patton's forces. So that's maybe the last tie-in of this story.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to glorify it, but it is a dirty business. And unfortunately, rule number 1 is young kids die. And rule number 2 is you can't change rule number 1. So we celebrate the loss of Marv's father and anybody else that was a part of that. Horrible time. But we go to better times. So we appreciate everybody being here today. We want to say thank you for tuning in. This has been 100 Yards of Football, and our show is called Take 5 with Steven Travers. Steven is the host of the show and an author of over 30 books, and we talked today about one of those ones that is a little bit different than the average sports book. So thank you for tuning in, everybody. We greatly appreciate it. We want to thank you for watching the show. If you're a person who liked it, please subscribe and tell a friend. We always want to grow the platform any way that we can. And in the meanwhile, we wish you all the best. We want to say thank you for tuning in and have a fantastic